2,000 years ago, one language ruled the Silk Road. Merchants from China to Byzantium spoke it to strike deals. Kings issued decrees in it. It was, for centuries, the language of trade across half the known world. Today, it survives in only a handful of villages high in the mountains of Tajikistan. Spoken by a few thousand people, the outside world has almost entirely forgotten. They're called the Yaghnobis. Their language is the last living descendant of Sogdian, the tongue of the Silk Road's greatest merchants. And in the 1970s, the Soviet Union tried to erase them completely. This is the story of the people who outlasted an empire's language, and then outlasted an empire itself. Long before the Silk Road had a name, Sogdian traders were already running it. Based in cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, in what's now Uzbekistan, the Sogdians built a trading network stretching from Constantinople to the Chinese capital of Chang'an. They weren't conquerors, they were something rarer in the ancient world, a civilization built almost entirely on commerce and cultural exchange. Sogdian merchants set up trading colonies in Chinese cities. Sogdian became the common trade language across Central Asia, the language you'd use to negotiate a caravan deal or write a business contract, regardless of your own native tongue. Sogdian scripts influenced the writing systems later used for Mongolian and Manchu. Sogdian art and religious ideas, a mix of Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, and even early Christianity, travelled with their caravans, shaping cultures thousands of miles from home. Then came the Arab conquests of Central Asia in the 8th century. Islam spread. Arabic and Persian became the languages of power and trade. Within a few centuries, the great cities of Sogdiana had abandoned their old language entirely. Historians assumed Sogdian died with its cities. They were almost right, except for one narrow, isolated valley that the New World never quite reached. High in the mountains of what's now Tajikistan lies the Yaghnob Valley, a narrow, harsh strip of land wedged between towering peaks, reachable for centuries only by mountain paths. It was here, cut off from the trade routes and the cities that had abandoned Sogdian, that a small population kept speaking a descendant of the old language. Isolated by geography rather than by choice, the Yaghnobis weren't preserving their language as an act of resistance. They simply never got the memo that everyone else had moved on. Their language, Yaghnobi, isn't identical to ancient Sogdian. Languages evolve even in isolation. But linguists consider it the only surviving descendant of that Silk Road tongue anywhere on Earth. Every other trace of spoken Sogdian is gone, preserved only in ancient manuscripts and inscriptions. For over 1,000 years, the Yaghnobis lived much as their ancestors had, herding livestock, farming what the harsh mountain terrain allowed, largely outside the reach of whichever empire technically claimed the region: Persian, Arab, Mongol, Russian. Then, in the 20th century, a different kind of empire decided the valley's isolation was a problem to be solved. In 1970, disaster struck the Yaghnob Valley. Mudslides and an outbreak of illness threatened the small population living there. Soviet authorities responded with a mass relocation. But what began as an emergency evacuation became something closer to forced cultural erasure. Soviet planners resettled the Yaghnobis onto lowland cotton plantations, hundreds of kilometers from their mountain valley, ostensibly for economic development, but the effect was to scatter a community of a few thousand people across unfamiliar territory, cut off from the isolation that had kept their language alive for a millennium. In their new lowland settlements, Yaghnobi children were schooled in Tajik and Russian. Without the valley's isolation protecting it, the language that had survived the fall of the Silk Road began disappearing within a single generation. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, most Yaghnobi speakers were elderly, and their children, raised in the lowlands, often understood the language without speaking it fluently themselves. It's a strange kind of tragedy. The language survived Arab conquest, Mongol invasion, and 1,000 years of empires rising and falling around its isolated valley, only to nearly die out in a matter of decades, once that isolation was deliberately broken. But the story doesn't end there. Starting in the 1990s, as Soviet control loosened and then disappeared entirely, small numbers of Yaghnobi families began doing something the authorities hadn't planned for. They walked back into the mountains. Families started resettling the Yaghnob Valley on their own, rebuilding villages that had been left empty for 2 decades. It's a difficult life. No roads reach some of the resettled villages, and modern conveniences are scarce. But for the families who returned, it was also a way to reclaim a language and a way of life the Soviet resettlement had almost destroyed. Today, linguists estimate only a few thousand Yaghnobi speakers remain, most of them older adults, with the language classified as endangered. Researchers have raced in recent years to record the last generation of fluent speakers before their vocabulary and grammar, final living echo of the Silk Road's great trade language, disappears for good. There's no certainty about how this story ends. Unlike some endangered languages that have seen genuine revival movements, Yaghnobi's survival depends on a small, aging population in one of the most remote inhabited valleys in Central Asia. But for now, in a handful of stone houses with no paved road in sight, someone is still speaking the last living words of Sogdian, the language that once negotiated deals across half the ancient world. Samarkand and Bukhara are UNESCO World Heritage Sites now, monuments to a trading civilization that shaped the ancient world. But the language that built them isn't in a museum. It's spoken today, quietly, by a few thousand people in a mountain valley most maps barely mark. The last surviving voice of the Silk Road. If you enjoyed the story of a people who outlasted an empire's reach, check out our video on the last Romans, linked above.